good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to this event in commemoration of Jewish American History Month. We're going to welcome back Danish scholar Dr. Therkel Straede, whose groundbreaking research traces the steps of the 470 Danish Jewish men and women and children and the elderly who were not evacuated during safe haven, but were sent to Theresienstadt, a Nazi ghetto near Prague. Once again, we are so lucky to have Dr. Straede here. He is a professor of contemporary history at the University of Southern Denmark. He has taught around the world and is the author of numerous articles and books. And in 2001, he was honored with a congressional citation by the U.S. House of Representatives for outstanding achievements in Holocaust research and education. And Dr. Strade's latest project is a new exhibit, which is going to be opening in our backyard in New York City in October at the New York City Museum of Jewish History, and it is geared toward children. It marks the 80th anniversary of the rescue of the Danish Jews. I just want to mention that both of Dr. Strade's presentations will be, so if you missed the first one or you know someone who needed to come to this one, will be rebroadcast live via the library website. The encore performance of Safe Haven, the rescue of the Danish Jews, will premiere on Thursday, June 22nd at 7, and the encore of this presentation, The Jews from Denmark in Theresienstadt, will premiere the following week on Thursday, June 29th at 7 p.m. These presentations will then be available, thank you, Dr. Straede, at any time on the library's YouTube channel once they are added at some time in early July. I need to thank the Friends of the Monmouth County Library for helping us make this possible. And I'm going to ask you to feel free to share any questions you have for Dr. Straede in the chat feature. We will address as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. So now we will be turning this program over to Dr. Straede.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you so much for your generous introduction. I have I have quite a few pictures to share with you. So I'll just go to screen sharing right away. And here we are. So let's move right away into the dark country of Nazi-dominated Europe at the time. In the 40s, where Germany, where the Nazis dominated almost the whole continent, including Denmark, which was occupied in 1940, and including Western Europe and a large part of Eastern Europe. This is the map, and if you follow my cursor, this is as far as the Germans got in 43, in 42. In 41, when the ghetto in Theresienstadt was opened, the front was going a lot like here. So it was not only a war of expansion that the Germans were waging on the rest of the world, including North Africa, actually, but also at the same time a war of annihilation of the Soviet Union. Communism was seen by the Nazis as their main enemy, and communism was also seen by the Nazis as a Jewish invention. So they didn't kind of divide between communism and Jews. They were fighting. They were fighting both. And in the course of the war, radicalized their anti-Jewish program from just wanting to evict the Jews from Europe in 1941, starting to a program of the total annihilation. The total annihilation program also reached Denmark 2 years later in 43, And it was actually reaching every single country under Nazi dominance, including also the countries that were allied, that were autonomous countries, but allied with Germany, like Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. What I'm going to talk about today is what happened to those Danish Jews who were not rescued. As you know, the majority of the Jews of Denmark were able to cross that very narrow sound of water between Denmark and Sweden by the help of their own initiative, and also of many non-Jews who want to join in the rescue operation. But here and there, in some places, things went wrong, and Jews were caught in attempting to escape. And these Jews were taken to Theresienstadt, which is located here around this place. On this topic, I made 5 years ago a project with my history and geography students at the University of Southern Denmark in Odense. We did field work in Theresienstadt, and we constructed the website. And the website is going to be fairly present in what I'm going to tell you here. And this is what it looks like. It's that kind of modern website where you do less description in words and more in writing, and more small movies that will explain to young people how to use it, because young people are our main users. It is a website that is collecting the memoirs, 58 memoirs of 51 survivors of the Theresienstadt Ghetto. And there were a total of 417 survivors, Danish survivors of the ghetto. So 50-some is a fairly high number. It's about half the number of those who actually wrote their memoirs or published their memoirs. And if we add video interviews, that number comes a bit higher. But we have a very good coverage, which enables me to give you an impression of what life was like materially, but also emotionally for the Jews in the ghetto, for the Jews from Denmark in the ghetto. Where do we turn to if we want knowledge about Theresienstadt? Of course, since we're in a library setting, we should start with books. Of course, we can Google, we can use the chat GTP, and but we can also use scholarly works. And these are I'd say the three of the main scholarly works on Theresienstadt. H.G. Adler was a survivor of the camp, and he was working in the ghetto administration. There was a Jewish, call it self-administration, that the Germans put up for the Jews to kind of be in charge of their own misery. And so he was, H.G. Adler was a sociologist, so he was very well able to analyze the system as it was developing and describe it after the war. And the book was published only 10 years after the events. The two most recent books, well, I should also show you this one, which is by one of the leading German historians, Wolfgang Benz, which is also kind of a general history of Theresienstadt, but unfortunately only available in German. In English, we have these two rather new works. Anna Heikova's The Last Ghetto, which is an everyday history of Theresienstadt, focusing very much on what life was like in the ghetto, how social relations developed in the ghetto. And then we have Sylvia Goldbaum-Tarbini Frakapane's book. She's a Danish scholar living in France. Her book, her dissertation from a German university on the Jews of Denmark in the Holocaust. And this is the only really major scholarly work on the topic. And I feel even if Sylvia is a tiny person, I feel that she has very strong shoulders to stand on. And that is what I am doing, what our project team has been doing. Let me also just mention a few of the books. Many, as I mentioned, many of the Danish survivors felt the urge to tell the world about their experiences. It was not always very easy because sometimes they would meet rejection when they started talking about these things. But in the end, actually, a substantial number of memoirs in shorter form, in longer form, in interviews, and so on, have been published. And these are some of the more, I'd say, interesting or Ralph Oppenheim published his novel. This is a novel. It is a memoir in the form of a novel, where Ralph Oppenheim is kind of uh, playing the role, or in the novel he's a woman, and Marianne Petit, and describing a lot of things that we know from his later memoirs are actually things he experienced himself, or things that his younger sister experienced in the ghetto. They were very young, but grown up. We can see that their mother, Melanie Oppenheim, who was a leading person in Danish Jewish life in those days, also published a book which came out in Danish long time ago and in English 20 years ago. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the book by Rabbi Friediger, which was also one of the earliest. And Friediger's book actually became kind of a model for the way in which many Danish Jews were telling their stories, narrating their experiences. Both because he had this position as a religious leader, and because the book was out there practically before almost every other book. One of the latest ones is published by child survivor Ib Katzenelson, who ended up an economist and the leading civil servant in the Danish Ministry of Finances, but almost was like constantly for 1.5 years close to dying of all sorts of diseases as a 2 to 3 years old in the Ghetto. And his book also was published in English. Actually, there's been 2 printings of it so far. I'll get back to Jytte Bornstein, which is a book which combines her artwork with memoirs. I'll get back to that later in the talk. Let's get the geography straight. And geography, topography is very crucial to our project. So from Denmark, there were basically 3 transports. That's not true. There were 4, but the fourth one was very small. The first transport would start, let me see, here, and be a train transport going down all the way of Jutland, the peninsula of Jutland, via Hamburg and Berlin to Theresienstadt. From Copenhagen, there would be 1 transport with ship to Świnoujście, it's called today in Poland, today's Poland, the border town, and from there to Berlin and to Theresienstadt. And then 2 smaller transports going down to Geza, crossing over to Rostock, where there was a ferry boat. So that would take the trains aboard and on via Berlin to Theresienstadt. These are the ways that the Danish Jews passed in order to get there. I mean, involuntarily, of course. A short overview of the Nazi persecution of the Jews. Of course, everything starts with the takeover of power of Hitler in 1933. That is, this is the time where a state actually decides to make anti-Semitism a substantial part of its policy. Until then, there had been a lot of attacks on Jews by Nazis and others, but now it became a state project to discriminate and get the Jews out of Germany. The Nuremberg racial laws from 1935 were part of this also, and for the first time defining who is actually a Jew according to Nazi standards, which were biological standards or biological based definition. The annexation of Austria radicalized the entire German policy against the Jews quite a lot. There was strong anti-Semitism in Austria, and this whole situation that Germany was in of being able to do whatever it wanted and nobody would kind of try to stop them kind of also made the project of getting rid of the Jews ever more urgent to Nazi decision makers. Forced immigration, Aryanization, meaning the confiscation of Jewish property. And then we have the attack on Poland following immediately, and the start of World War II, which meant another round of radicalization. This is where shootings of Jews, selective shootings in the beginning, are starting, and a very radical discrimination, throwing Jews out of every position they had. And other radicalization. By 1941, the German attack on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, as seen by the Germans, I mentioned that, as the main enemy, both because of communism and Judaism. And the Germans, the Nazis, didn't really see a contradiction, the same contradiction that we would see in this kind of project. From 1941 on, historians disagree about exactly when the total physical annihilation of Jews is on the agenda, and there is the idea that there will be no Jews and also no traces of Jewish culture left once they're finished. Starting with massacres and then moving to death camps for reasons that we shouldn't discuss here. For Denmark, the Nazi takeover of power meant that a refugee wave hit the Danish shores. I mean, Germany is just very, very, very near to Denmark, and Jews and non-Jews were fleeing to Denmark. Most of them for political reasons, because the first assault of the Nazis against their opponents were against socialists and communists, and not against Jews primarily, but also Jews were, of course, partly some of the Jews were socialists and communists and were hit by persecution that way. During the 30s, Denmark was very reluctant to take in Jewish refugees, especially Jewish refugees, but for fear that would provoke the Germans to take steps that the Danes didn't want to, like violent steps against the country. But of course, as we know now, this policy of appeasement did not prevent the occupation, which happened in 1940. It brought about a situation where the Danish political structures and administration, but also business and agriculture, would cooperate with the Germans, but it ideologically tried to keep them kind of at arm's length and not submit to any of the Nazi visions of the new Europe under German domination. So it was clearly seen as like a defensive situation by the Danish decision. In 1943, the mood in the Danish population had changed towards a positive identification with resistance, in the end forcing the Danish government to resign, and then kind of provoking the Germans to hit hard down on the Danes, and hitting hard meant moving against the Jews. So on September 8, 1943, after the August uprising, the Germans decided to deport the Danish Jews. And shortly before the deportation was scheduled, Werner Best decided that it actually kind of had turned out that it would be quite counterproductive what he already had ordered would be counterproductive. So he kind of sabotaged his own order and had a secret agent whisper into the ears of leading social democrats, and those were the leading politicians of Denmark in those days, that there will be an assault on the Jews and you'd better get away somehow. And this was passed by Rabbi Marcus Melchior onto the Jews in a situation where, like, he happened to have the synagogue full of co-religionists, and most Jews went into hiding as the German Judenaktion emerged or was let loose on October the 1st. So most Jews got away to Sweden. We talked about that last time. And what we are focusing on now would be the deportees, those who were captured and sent off to Theresienstadt. They did not experience liberation in Theresienstadt because the Danish authorities got the possibility of repatriating them only weeks before the end of the war in April 1945. The total loss of Jewish life, the Jewish population in Europe, according to the Wannsee Conference Protocol, is kind of the perpetrators, like making this complete overview of the Jews of every single European country. 11 million people were about to die, and as the war ended, 6 million had actually died because of the Nazi persecution. In Denmark, we have small numbers. The Jewish population, of course, according to the Wannsee Conference, was 5,600. In 1944, a survey was made in Sweden about the Danish Jewish refugees who were in the country at that time, and it was summed up to 7,600. So somehow the Nazi records were not good enough, or their definition deviated from the definitions that people used themselves. In a situation where Jews were hunted, I mean, would they bring themselves into security or not? That depends on what you expect the opponent, the Germans, to do in that situation. So some people would also flee who were not actually covered by the Nazi definition of Jews. Anyway, the number of the deportees were 470, and you may see deviating numbers in earlier literature, but thanks to Sylvia Goldbaum-Tarbini-Fakabane, we know exactly where the errors come from, and among others from the fact that actually 5 of those who were sent to Theresienstadt were repatriated only weeks after they had arrived to the ghetto. And this, I believe, did not happen for anyone else who was sent to this place. The total loss of Jewish lives during the occupation in Denmark was 116 persons, and of those, 53 of them had died in Theresienstadt ghetto. We also have should not forget the fact that more than 200 Jews survived in hiding in Denmark, most of them young children, very young children, even babies, who, because in those days it was considered very dangerous to take the very small children along. They would cry and they would alert the Germans or denunciators and so on and so forth. So in many cases, they were left with non-Jewish families or in orphanages. Now let's move by airplane to Terezín. So Terezín is the name today. In the Czech Republic, it's like 60 kilometers north of Prague. This part of Terezín, as you see, was a fortress city. It was built as a fortress in the 18th century. never really saw battle, actually, because this kind of fortifications very quickly lost their military relevance. But it was there, and it was built for a garrison of soldiers. This part became the ghetto. This part became the part that was where the German personnel and also Czech policemen were living. So this was the Aryan side. And over here in the back, you see kind of well, it's just a green area. Behind that is the so-called Kleine Festung, the small fortress. This is the one you see here. And it is from here we also see this sign, which we also, I mean, the wording we know from Auschwitz. It was a proper concentration camp, only it was not the place where the Jews were taken. The Jews were here, and the concentration camp was over here. It's like 1.5 kilometers across. Mostly as sources to Theresienstadt history, we mostly have photos that have been made by the Germans for propaganda reasons, for a propaganda purpose. But we also have some of the artists, and many artists actually lived into this, and some of them were able to do artistic works which provide us with a feeling of what things were really like behind the propaganda facade. And one of them is Bente Friete, from whom we have a lot of pictures like this one, describing everyday life in the ghetto. So, a short overview of the history. Built in inaugurated in 1780 as a garrison city. It was kind of dimensioned for 7,000 people. Soldiers, half soldiers, and half like their families and people who were servicing the military. In 1940, the small fort was put up, was taken into use by the Gestapo of Prague as a concentration camp, and eventually also an execution site. So, if you go to that place today and you go to the you're most likely to start your visit in the small fortress, and you will see the gallows, and you will see the places where shooting took places in that place. Only many people throughout the decades have believed that this was where the Jews were taken, and that's not the case. The Jews were in the city in itself. The ghetto, the first group of Jews was sent to the ghetto in November 1941, just after the deportations from Germany started to the east. And there's a very close relation between the deportations and the ghetto in Theresienstadt, because the deportations to the east, which all of them ended up in places where people got shot, they were taking place under the label of Arbeitseinsatz, meaning we are sending Jews to work. So it would give little meaning to send elderly people, infirms, the veterans of World War I to work at these work camps in the East. So the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, Heydrich was the chief of that. They invented this idea that we will have a special ghetto for the aged, and also a place to send prominent Jews, being, for instance, Jews who had international contacts or who had a standing in international cultural life, and so on and so forth. In otherwise, it would be curious if they just disappeared. The first group of Jews who came to Theresienstadt were Czech Jews, and this was also the largest population. So Theresienstadt was the concentration point of the Czech Jews before being taken on to Auschwitz and other annihilation camps. And then in the course of 1942, as many of the Czech Jews have already been moved and to these places and killed, the German Jews are moving in, and all Germany at that time, also including Austria. Eventually, also smaller groups from Holland, from Luxembourg, Slovakia, Hungary, France were incarcerated in the ghetto. And in October 1943, we have the arrival of 475 Jews, out of whom 5 were repatriated shortly after arrival. They were living there. They had quite large losses in the winter of 43, 45. It was cold. It was very cold in the ghetto. Food was not sufficient, and many of the elderly people were dependent on medicine that they were not allowed to get, or it wasn't provided for them. So most of the casualties actually happened during the first months of the stay of the Danish Jews in Theresienstadt. In the spring, in the early spring, actually in February, the first parcels appeared. The Danish authorities were able to, after much pressure, to get a permission to send food parcels to Theresienstadt. And these food parcels did a marvelous job in providing them, the Danish Jews, with some of the nourishment that they couldn't get in everyday life. So it saved a lot of human lives. The Danish authorities also pressured for permission to visit the Jews. And the Germans would say, well, they're fine. There's no reason to visit them. There's no reason to send food, and so on and so forth. And the Danish authorities would say, okay, sure. And eventually, after a number of postponements, the visit of a Danish Red Cross delegation actually took place on June 23rd, 1944. And before that, the ghetto had been beautified, which means that facades had been painted and curtains had been put up in windows and flowers been planted, and the music pavilion built on the central square, where an orchestra, a symphony orchestra, was playing under the conduction of the famous Danish Jewish conductor, Peter Deutsch. Let's just jump to the very last months of the ghetto. What happens in the meantime is that Jews from the other, like German Jews, Austrian Jews, Jews from other nationalities are taken out of the ghetto and sent to the annihilation camp as more or less on a regular basis. And the Danish Jews were protected against this. There was a secret agreement between Adolf Eichmann and the head of the Nazi administration in Denmark, Werner Best, that the Danish Jews should stay in Theresienstadt. Only they didn't know, so they were scared. They were scared. When will our time come to be sent away? And nobody, of course, told them that they were being sent directly to the gas chambers. But the smarter of them actually knew, or kind of had a feeling of what this is going to mean. At least, if they send us away, it will be to a place that is even more. The evacuation, I mentioned that, also as a result of a constant pressure by the Danish authorities on the Germans. And that saved the Danish Jews from being part of the chaos of the last days, where many prisoners poured in, and many were very ill, and they were full of contagious diseases. So many also died, and many died after the liberation because of this. After the war, well, the Czech townspeople who used to live in the city had been moved out as the ghetto was put up, and they could now move in. And eventually memorial museums were put up, focusing first on Czech national suffering and resistance, and then eventually, mostly after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakdown of communism, also increasing the memory of Jewish suffering. But it was already during communist time in Czechoslovakia. There was a battle between, let's say, communist survivors of the ghettos and the Communist Party, where the survivors wanted to commemorate the fact that Theresienstadt was not just a concentration camp, but it was actually a place of Jewish suffering. Here we have the numbers. I won't go through them in detail, but just draw your attention to this fact that of the German Jews and Austrian Jews who were brought to there, half of them died in the ghetto. So there was disease, there was a constant dying in the ghetto. And for this reason, they also built a crematorium with several ovens in order to cope with this problem. As you can see, if we go down to the Danish Jews, 53 died, including the babies who were born there. And one man was sent off to Auschwitz with a larger transport. He happened to be in the mental asylum of Theresienstadt, as that asylum was emptied and sent off to Auschwitz. The transports from Denmark, from Aalborg through Jutland, and with all the Jews who were caught on the island of Funen, where Odense is located, joining them, and then this one transport with a ship to Swinoujscie, and smaller train transports from Elsinore. Elsinore is very close to Horserød. Horserød is the internment camp where Jews who were caught in Denmark were first brought and then collected in order to be shipped off in larger numbers. And the smaller transports were people who were considered by the Nazis of having a special issue that should be cleared up before the deportation. For instance, a number of Jews who had become Jewish by conversion. I mean, born Christian and then converted to Jews. Would they be considered Aryan, like blood-wise, or should they be considered Jewish? And the Germans had to clear that out before they deported them. You can see the number of men and women, and you can see that 49 of the deportees from Denmark were underage. And that another 2 were born in the ghetto. The Danish Jews basically consisted in those days of 3 major groups. The old Danish Jewish families, those who had been living in the country for decades or even much longer, and most of them belonged to the upper class, or the upper middle class. Melanie Oppenheim is an example of this group, and so is her son, of course, Ralph Oppenheim, who wrote the novel. Then we had an influx of Russian Jews, Jews from Tsarist Russia, mostly for many because of poverty, but also for political reasons. Left-wing Jews who wanted to had fought Tsarism and were forced to flee because of political activities or trade union activities. Katznelson, his family is one of those families. So these people were first or second generation immigrants, you could say, at the time of the deportation. And then we have the third group, which are the German Jews, including also Austrian and Czech Jews, because Czechoslovakia part of it became part of Germany. Those are refugees from Hitler's regime, and most of them belong to upper or middle class families. But in Denmark, their status was very low, and they had very few economic means because they were living as refugees, and they were not allowed to work. The ghetto. Here you have the contrast between a German propaganda photo. I mean, this doesn't look like a place you would like to live, does it? But it's not as it is far from as crowded as it was in real life. It's supposed to tell Germans, okay, so we are taking care of the Jews. They have a place to lie down. They're getting fed, and so on and so forth. But they're not living in luxury. Very important for Germans because many Germans were anti-Semites. And this is another drawing by Therkel Straede, which kind of brings us close to the extreme narrowness of living conditions, because many people were living together on very limited space. Although it was a whole city, at its highest, 60 to 65,000 Jews were living in a city that had been dimensioned for 6 to 7,000. So you can imagine. The Danish Jews shared the conditions of the other ghetto dwellers, the crowded housing, the poor hygiene resulting from it, of course, and also resulting from the fact that the Germans didn't pay attention to providing the means for sanitation and so on and so forth. Hunger, malnutrition, the number of calories that were allowed for Jewish prisoners in the ghetto were much lower than was necessary for actually to keep up your normal constitution. And this, of course, led to the diseases, and there was a lack of medicine in Tennessee, but there was not a lack of doctors. Many Jewish doctors were taken there, and but they had very little to do. And the medicine, more specialized medicine, they had to kind of engage in black market activities in order to get it into the ghetto, which was dangerous and which could easily lead to, if you were taken sort of by the Czech police that was guarding the ghetto, or the German SS with contraband, you would be deported right away or sent to the Heinz Fest. And those few Jews who were sent to the concentration camp next to the ghetto were such people who were engaged in the smuggling. Common for all, the fear, the despair, the emotional strain, the stress of the lack of privacy, the stress of not knowing where is this going to end and how is it going to end, am I going to live, and so on and so forth. For the Danes specifically, well, the Danes were deported rather late to Tennessee. So and this is, of course, because of the policy of cooperation, because as long as that was running quite kind of smoothly, and the Danish economy was kind of providing the exports for Germany that the Germans wanted, and so on and so forth, and their peace and calm was reigning in the country of Denmark. As long as that was the fact, the Germans did not give priority to persecuting the Jews. And this is the reason why the persecution only was brought about at the time when the policy of cooperation had broken down, because of popular resistance in the population. So you can say that the resistance actually brought the Jews into danger. That was not an aim, of course, but it was unavoidable, the way the Nazis prioritize things. So the late deportation was a lifesaver, because the longer the stay in such an environment, the lower the chance of surviving. And also the fact that there were no transports of Danish Jews out of the ghetto to the annihilation sites, of course, were extremely important, and so were parcels. And it's important to stress that the Danish authorities pushed for the delivery of foodstuffs to the Danes in the ghetto, which was sent by mail to individual Jews in the ghetto, but the Danish authorities organized that every single deportee would get food parcels, also even from people they didn't know. But before that, a Jewish help group had already been providing help parcels to Theresienstadt, not to Danish deportees, as there were none, but to other deportees. The Pels group actually organized around a couple of elderly German Jews who had fled from Germany to Denmark and started this amazing help organization. The Red Cross inspection has been very much discussed in literature, and for good reasons, because the inspectors wrote like 3 reports, and these 3 reports are mostly give a very, you could say, skewed, very positive picture of the ghetto. Only the reports were intended to impress the Germans. They were intended to make the German believe that the Danish inspectors believed the picture that they were showing them, the propaganda picture, and to nail the Germans to keep things as they had pretended them to be. It's kind of difficult, isn't it? But it is a scam, kind of. But the idea is that, okay, so if this is what you want us to believe, then please make sure that things won't change for the worse. And this is the way I see these reports. They are slightly different. One report was made directly for the German authorities, and that's more positive than the ones that were made for internal Danish use. But also the ones that were made for internal Danish use were written in the assurance that at one point the Germans might get to see them and read over the shoulder. I mentioned already the evacuation. The white buses was a joint Danish, Norwegian, Swedish evacuation operation that started already in December 1944 with evacuation of Danish policemen who had been taken to Buchenwald. And eventually, at the very end of this huge transport organization, which was able to take more than 20,000 prisoners out of Germany in time, there was little left but Theresienstadt. And at that time, Folke Bernadotte, who was the Swedish, you could say, like head of the organization, he encountered strong resistance from Heinrich Himmler to the idea of evacuating the Jews, and gave in. But personnel in his organization did not want to just let the Jews leave the Jews to their destiny, and organized that they be picked up no matter if Bernadotte was against it. So that is what actually happened, and it was a very, very dangerous operation because all Germany was at war, and allied. In Germany, it's called Tiefflieger, which means fighter airplanes that go along the roads very low and shoot at everything, were operating at all roads in Germany. What happened here? Well, let me tell you a little bit more about the website. We have like 2 channels. That's the website, and there's an Instagram profile which kind of supplements it. It brings news about Theresienstadt, news about the project, also even also news about today's event. So what we're trying to map is what life was like, objectively, but basically subjectively. That is the way the survivors, on writing their recollections, choose to see life. I mean, it's their priorities, and we do not, and this is perhaps somewhat unorthodox for historians, we do not correct them if they make errors, like chronological, or as far as this at this place this happened. No, it was in the next street. It was not this street, and so we don't correct them. So the maps are also include these kind of errors, which are the errors of a normal human mind that is thinking back to things that happened in the past. Our target groups in the beginning, well, the first group we had in mind were the survivors and their descendants. 2018 was the 75th anniversary of the deportation, and of course of the assault on the Danish Jews. So we thought that this would be our contribution, and the survivors would like to see their experience highlighted, since, as you can imagine, the story of the very much larger Jewish population that actually was rescued has been dominating for quite a long time. We also had schools in mind from young people from 15 years up, and it works, we can say, the general public, and also the media, because we knew and we know that the media needs access to, like easy access to data, but also to, what can you say, narratives that are emotional. The digital mapping 40 printed books, articles, interviews, some of them short, some of them very long, and one of the books is almost 400 pages. We included 18 video interviews, most of them made by the USC Shoah Foundation, but some of them also made by Danish television over the years. We decided only to focus on pinpointable places and spaces, that is, places that are identifiable, easily identifiable in the texts, and by comparing the text with the actual situation in the ghetto. And you must know, maybe you've been there. If you haven't, the buildings of the ghettos are still standing. Theresienstadt turned back to be a normal city, only very depopulated. So many buildings are in a bad condition, but nothing has been changed. No new roads have been made. No new construction works, and so on and so forth. There's a surplus of square meters for in the city. So for this particular reason, what you see today, if you go there, is very much the same structure that the Jews were seeing when they were suffering through the ghetto period. We wanted to make comparisons possible. We have these individual maps, and every single map is kind of an index in the form of a digital map to one of these narratives. So we have, in some cases, same person has given more than one text, and so we have two maps for that person. We also have these collective maps, and the collective maps are the maps that kind of like bring together or bring together specific elements, and all of it is done with topography in mind, you can say. Our approach is quite different from the one that is described by the Franz Kafka Museum in Prague in this small piece of text. It's not important that we are not able to. Prague's topography is ever present in his work, but unnamed. So we can't identify the various institutions and buildings and so on and so forth. He transforms the actual topography into an imaginary topography and uses the elements of topography, the elements of architecture as metaphors and allegorical places. And what we're doing in our project is exactly the opposite of Franz Kafka. We are locating the pinpointable points of the recognizable places, and we are disregarding all those elements of a memoir, of a narrative that are not attached to a specific place. And much of that is actually important information, and also important to understand, like say, the emotions of the survivors. But this is our choice, and it has a cost. We were very much inspired by these three books. A large project that was initiated by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum way back, and has resulted in a number of stunning scholarly works. The Nazis also had a nose, you could say, for topography. Topography was subject to battles, how is about use, but also about meaning. And here you have an example. This is a map showing what the street naming of the Theresienstadt was like back in the days when it was a garrison city, meaning the first couple of years of the ghetto, the streets didn't have names; they just had these numbers and letters. each of them meaning a specific block. So your address would be like C4, number this and this, for instance. In 1944, in relation to the in preparation of the Danish inspection, all of these streets got names which are like kind of mundane names, like the City Hall Street, or Mountain Street, or Post Office Street, and or Bakery Street, and there was actually a bakery here. The one of the two bakeries were here. So this was in order to present the picture to the inspectors that this was a normal city. It was a way of like covering up the reality of a like the camp-like reality, an intentional creation of, you could say, of false memory in the renaming of the streets. And the Germans got the idea that, or the impression that they had been so successful in fooling the inspectors that they eventually decided to do a propaganda film, a documentary, and some of you might know it by the names Der Führer schenkt den Juden eine Stadt. The Führer gives a city to the Jews, which is a title that it got only after World War II. It was only finished in April 1945. It was seen by less than 10 persons before the war ended. But the idea was to provide a picture of like the Jews living happily and also in a self-organized situation, living happily ever on, and in this way cover the actual genocide that had been taking place in most of Europe. Salah Fisherman, sadly, he passed away last year, was a member of the film crew. A young man, he wasn't a skilled electrician, but he was employed as an electrician, like moving around lamps and cables and things like that, and also at one point given a small role in the movie, actually being put at a work bank and having to work with the actual forced laborers there. He was a forced laborer in propaganda, you could say, and was very conscious already in those days about the dilemma. And the dilemma was underlined by the fact that at the time, when this propaganda movie, when all the shootings of the film, of the footage had been done, the whole film crew was sent away to Auschwitz and murdered, except for Stanley, because Stanley was Danish. So he was protected. Another young man who was deported was Heinz Fest, and I'm sorry that I don't have a picture of him. He was born in Ústí nad Labem, which is part of the border, which is the border between the Czech Republic and Germany, a Czech Jew, and arrived there in Theresienstadt with one of the Danish transports. He had come to Denmark as a youth, a youngster, and then grown up and become a young man at the time of deportation. And Heinz Fest can be used to show you the categories that we used in working on all these memoirs. This is his map. This is his interactive digital map. I didn't confide in having a stable enough internet connection to be able to show you this on the internet, actually. So I've kind of made slides of it. I hope you forgive me for that. You can see we put in this map, and this is the map that was made by the Jewish self-administration at the time, just before the Danish inspectors arrived, with the new names, and we are putting it as kind of a folio on top of a normal Google-based map, the state of 2018, in order kind of to make sure that everybody who uses this website is aware that we are not mapping reality. We are mapping the reality as it worked inside the minds of the survivors, not the material reality. We had some discussions, a lot of discussions with historians, with whether we should correct or not the memoirs, but decided not to do that. The categories we are using are the place of housing, you can see, work sites, and then other categories which are not represented in Heinz Fest's memoir because it's a very short memoir. Places of where food was handed out, places where medical treatment was received, places where he engaged in or observed black market activities, and then places of fear and free spaces. These are the categories. Let me move on to another ghetto dweller from Denmark. The chief rabbi of Denmark, Max Friediger, was taken hostage by the Germans already in August 1943 and kept in Horsovre in that internment camp in northern Zealand, and deported from there to Theresienstadt. And he immediately in Denmark, in Theresienstadt, I kind of got the role of kind of the spokesperson of the Danish Jews. Although more than half of the Danish Jews did not belong to the Jewish community, but rather belonged to socialist and communist circles, or to the Lutheran Danish state church or something like that. The Germans made the chief rabbi the spokesperson of all the Danish Jews, and that was quite controversial amongst the deportees. Actually, what we have here is the kind of from the registry, his registry letter stating all his achievements and academic titles, and he had a lot of those, and his personal details. And this is the place where he worked because it's the Magdeburg Barrack. This is the place where the Jewish self-administration was located. Friediger was first taken into the Jewish Council as an observant, as sitting in but not having a vote. And then from 1944, when a lot of the original members of the council were sent off to the gas chambers, he was moved up to become a full member of the Council of Elders, as it was called, and took over responsibility for the cultural work, which was part of what was keeping up spirit, and also could serve him as kind of a cloak for keeping up at least rudimentary religious praxis in the ghetto. He was also the funeral official, meaning that a rabbi was not allowed to practice, and the Germans had forbidden that, but he was able to kind of be in charge of the funeral, and there were many, and make sure that they had kind of a Jewish touch. If not the right touch, at least that they would be conducted in ways that would not be offensive from a Jewish point of view. He definitely saw this as resistance. He saw this as a way of standing up against the Germans. Some of the other, his countrymen from Denmark saw him very critically. And he is up against this and arguing against it. This is in his book from 1946, published only a year before he died. He was already an old man when he came to Theresienstadt, but clearly 1.5 years under those conditions did not help to give him a long life. Let's move on to where did the Danes live? Well, the 50-some that we have mapped, you can see there's a concentration of places here. These are the so-called South Barracks, and that's the place where the Danes were moved as they first arrived in the ghetto. And then eventually they were taken inside the ghetto wall into the proper ghetto space. Some of them moving eventually in the course of the preparation for the inspection to private homes in this area, the so-called Danish houses. And those who were able to move there, or who would get permission to move there, were the so-called privileged Jews, those who had held positions in the Danish Jewish community and family of the same people, and some other, you could say, where hardship could advocate the fact that they would get not their own room, but a room shared with fewer people than those who were living in other places, in those barracks, and in many cases in the roof constructions of these buildings under very cramped conditions. One of the categories which has turned out to be the most interesting actually is the category of feared places. Which are the places that are described as places of fear in the memoirs of the survivors? And we see that there are distinct places that many are mentioning. This place, the Bauscherwitzer Kessel, this place, the Hamburg Kaserne, this place, the Aussiger Kaserne, the Jäger Kaserne, and this place, which is the Kleine Festung, the concentration camp. Only one single deportee from Denmark ever ended up here. But as you can see, many of the survivors mentioned this place as a specifically fearful place because they knew that torture was going on there, that executions were going on there, and they knew that the first head of the Jewish Council and his family were taken there and executed at one point. I mean, knew from rumors, of course, but these rumors were consistent with reality. So analytically, one can use these kind of maps for many things, and you can start speculating what is so dangerous about this place. That you see the railway line coming into the ghetto here, and this is the railway that where the trains would leave for the annihilation camps. So many Danish Jews were fearing the day where they would themselves be taken to that place. It didn't happen, but they couldn't know, and they never got any, you could say, certainty that they would not be following the rest that were taken out to to whichever destiny was awaiting. Let me give you one example of this place, because this is a crucial experience that many, as you can see, many Danish Jews were describing. Alex Eisenberg, a young man from Leipzig in Germany, who had fled to Denmark. He had come to Denmark as a Kramut, that is a Zionist agricultural pioneer, in order to do agricultural training in Denmark and then move on to Palestine eventually. But along came the German occupation, and he wasn't able to leave Denmark, and he was caught in 1943, deported. That's how he got to Theresienstadt. And we can see his map, a number of field spaces. Also, he describes receiving food at the largest of the community kitchens, and he describes some places as free spaces, home, several places of work. Sometimes it's only work for one day. Sometimes it's a place where the person has worked for an extended period. Let's see what he's writing about the Bauscherwitzer Castle. Bauscherwitzer Castle, the event on November 11th, 1943. And I'll just briefly, while you can read while I talk, I'll just briefly tell you what it's about. He is the whole ghetto population is called up to move out of the ghetto onto a meadow in front of which is located between the ghetto and the crematorium. And that is already scary. And why are everybody going to get out there? They need to be counted. And they need to be counted because the Gestapo in Prague had arrested some runaways from Theresienstadt. Not Danish runaways, but Czech runaways who could easily hide, but eventually they were caught. And so the Germans wanted to make sure that their lists and their identity, that the identity of every single person in the ghetto, and we're talking at this time about more than 40,000 people, would be noted. So this counting lasted a whole day. Very early, they would stand up. They would get nothing to eat, nothing to drink. There would be no way to to go away for natural causes. So you'd have to just do wherever you stood. And Alex Eisenberg is describing this as kind of the fringe between a time, between time, meaning some kind of normal continuity of life, and a timeless situation, which meaning a living death situation. So there's the painful illusion that we are in time. We are not yet timeless. Time hasn't stopped for us. We are not yet on the brim of being killed. But then you can see, and eventually he calls the ghetto dwellers, he's talking about 50,000. That's a bit over exaggerated, but not much. He's mentioning them as time bearers, those who still have kind of life continuity in them. But then, as standing here, of course, it was a very stressful situation, and he's describing the anxiety that is moving through those masses of people, and comparing it with a ship in an ocean. And then we have this very strong emphasis on sounds, screams, shouts of the SS, and so on and so forth. And suddenly the sound of approaching planes. And this is, of course, where all these 40 to 50,000 Jews who are standing in long lines and not allowed to move are getting really terrified, because they think, well, the Germans are going to shoot us like from the air. They're going to attack us. This is going to be our death. And every single survivor is describing this situation. No, that's not true. More than half of those 50-some testimonies we have describe this particular situation. Alex Eisenberg describes it very plastically, I think. So this play between silence and noise and silence. And as we hear the silence, as at the bottom of the sea, a deep sigh, as everyone realizes, okay, the machines did not attack. We can almost feel this deep sigh from 50,000 throats with Alex Eisenberg. And this is one of his, I'd say, he's one of the very able narrators. Really. Do we still have time, Robin? I hope so, because I have taken these. I have a few maps about the feared places. Here it is combined with the place of origin, or you could say ethnic. As I mentioned to you, 3 distinct groups of Danish Jews were deported. The old Danish families, the Russian immigrant families, and the German refugees, and then a few others, like one man born in Argentina, for instance, one man born in Iceland, and so on. So here we have kind of split these groups, so you can see that Danish, German, and Russian Jews and the others, there's no pattern, no significant pattern in the way they remember these events. Many of them concentrate on the same fearful places. But you can see it's not that one group is particularly fearful, or one group is, say, gotten used to German terror and does not mobilize fear in the situation of the Auschwitz Kessel, for instance, or when thinking about that fearful place, which is the concentration camp across the river. If we use the age category, we worked with 3 age categories. The adults the children, those who were children back then, meaning up until 15 years old, and the elderly. And from the elderly, we don't have so many memoirs for obvious reasons, because many of them were so elderly that they only survived a few years after the war for natural reasons, and perhaps also unnatural reasons because their health had been ruined in the ghetto. At any rate, we don't have that many memoirs written down or narrated by people who were already elderly when they were in the ghetto. But what we see, we don't see this. I'd say this. I'd say the same thing. There's not a very significant picture in which places are remembered as places of fear. Only that obviously the children are not very strongly represented as but again they weren't in the sample as such. So we can't draw much conclusions from this particular map, other than obviously there was kind of a common fear of the places that are being mentioned. Whereas, of course, some of these places are very individual and represent individual experiences of fear or beatings or something. But then if we look at gender, we see a significant picture. We can see that focusing on this, the Kleine Festung, the concentration camp, very few women mention this place as a place of fear. Whereas the Bauschowitzer Kessel, the counting on the meadow, is mentioned by very many women, almost like equal number of men and women. And we can see that also almost an equal number of men and women mention the Hamburger Kaserne, the place of the departure of the transports to the east, with fear. What is going on? Obviously, there is a difference in the, perspective of female survivors as opposed to male survivors. And it is, and I've been speculating, but I can't really say that I have substantiated my thesis completely, that women of those days were raised to think very close to home, about things very close to home, taking care of their home, and taking care of children, taking care of the like family in a narrower sense, and they were not raised to care much about politics, about the larger lines in society. I mean, this is the stereotype. I know that, because there are significant examples of also women who very early get involved in politics and become members of parliament or members of city councils and things like that. But the general, like, Jewish upbringing in those days would be apolitical for women. And this might be a reason why so very few women actually mention that there is a concentration camp nearby and that Jews are being sent there. Because in order to kind of make that part of your narrative, you have to think about the power structure of the whole ghetto. And you have to kind of to think politically about what is the situation, about the situation you're in. And I suspect that if we go into depth with the differences between the narratives of men and women on this particular issue, I mean, I've done that enough, but not systematically, to know that I think I'm on a safe track. The gender roles of those days are kind of being mirrored in the way survivors after the war are thinking about and telling stories about the ghetto. Let's move to the free spaces. The free spaces, of course, are the uplifting spaces, and this is the reason why we have a parachute or a balloon as a symbol for them. And you will notice that one free space is here, and this is the only of all these places on the fortress wall where the Jews were allowed access. Up here, there were like very, very primitive facilities for sport, handball, and things like that. And there were a few benches too. So this was the place where Jews were actually allowed to go for a walk. And once you were up there, you were able to see these walls are very high. So you were able to see the surrounding countryside, and you were able to see the mountains in the back, and so on and so forth. And many of the ghetto dwellers mention this place, especially because the ability of stretching out your vision and being able to see there's a world outside of this hell was an uplifting experience and helped get them through the everyday life. So this is one of the reasons, and then and these ones are focused on a particular place where some of the cultural events took place. A particular a former sport club that where concerts were organized at some various occasions. Let us go back to once again Alex Eisenberg, and one of his very personal places of freedom is the horse stable, where he worked at the time, and which is the stable where the SS forces were being cared for and were like being kept when not in use. This is also a place where he was able to get close to the garbage bins of the SS kitchen. And from there, he and his friend, friendship meant a lot to the ghetto dwellers. I mean, to have somebody to share your feelings with, but also to kind of to protect your back if you were doing things that were against the ghetto order. They organized all sorts of like leftovers and waste from the kitchen, and they turned that into wonderful meals. And to Alex Eisenberg, this is not just a matter of like for once eating in so much that you're not hungry, but it's also a piece of resistance. It's kind of, we could see the ransacking of garbage bins as a self-humiliation, an act of self-humiliation. But to Alex Eisenberg, it's an act of resistance. He needs these leftovers in order to produce a meal that would remind him and his friend about how things were in those days when we were not prisoners. He would cook up meals that for him was a maintenance and lifting up of the democratic culture. I mean, imagine this political, this politicization of the simple act of cooking a meal. But since it's a meal of the SS, instead of seeing this as, okay, so I'm eating the leftovers from the rich, to use a picture, instead for him, this is, I take from the SS and I turn it into a part of a work of art, a part of our culture, which he is just defining as a democratic culture. So you have democracy against authoritarianism in that simple meal. Sharing food, sharing it equally, you can sense that he is a socialist. We have chosen to do it ourselves. It's not something that we do because we are commanded to it. We work together in a community, the two of us, of course, and this is something that makes us regain our self-esteem. It strengthens our will to live. And I mean, this is what memoirs can do. They can bring you close to the symbolic and emotional elements of everyday life. here just probably a very simple meal, but certainly a tasty one. An example of Amidah, as it's called in Hebrew, I mean the ability of standing up for your values. In this case, the values of democracy, the values of equality, fraternity, actually. So to me, it's this is a very, what can you say dense place of freedom, a free space. Let me just introduce you, as I'm approaching the end, to Jutta Bornstein, who was one of the child survivors and who went through a long and horrible, after post-war history of mental institutions and not being able to cope with the experiences. But painting and making drawings became part of her therapy, and her book, My Travel Back, has been published in several printings in Denmark, all again and again with a new cover on and slightly different. So Jutta was a Russian Jew, a descendant of Russian Jews, and at this time, I mean, this picture is taken just shortly before this picture. I mean, this is Jutta. This is her doll. The doll comes along. The doll, which is called Meta, comes along to Theresienstadt and is kind of her support, emotional support all through, because she's getting separated at least from her father, and the mother has great difficulties coping with the situation and with the fact of being in this horrible situation with a child. Jutta describes it one place, and it's really kind of fantastic. It's really emotionally very strong. She describes that they are living in a kind of a mass quarter, and the only thing they have is kind of like one bunk bed for mother and child, and this is also the only place where she can really play. So she is playing on that bunk bed, and there's a mattress which is made by filled with straw and then like a very coarse fabric, and she is turning that mattress into a landscape, and then she is having her doll moving around the landscape, and part of the landscape is Sweden, where she knows that part of her family has landed. Part of the landscape is the ghetto. Part of the landscape is somewhere you could say kind of a wonder world. And so the doll is moving across mountains and behind buildings. Those are, for instance, the cardboard boxes that were sent with foodstuff and so on and so forth, and moving around this landscape. I mean, to emphasize that topography is not just an invention of scholars to kind of that we are kind of implying onto these texts, but actually topography and the way of perceiving the world through topography, through actually creating your own spaces, is part of the experience of at least some of the ghetto dwellers, like Jutta Bornstein. I should not move that fast because we need to see some of Jutta's pictures, and as you will notice, these pictures are very orderly. They are very technically, they're very fine. They're very fine. The perspective is fine, and so on and so forth. But they're also somehow distant. I mean, this is my interpretation, kind of lifeless. And these are pictures that she has made during her therapy after the war. So it's like this, they kind of atomize the need, the urge she feels to address the experience she had, but then also to distance herself from it. And I can't help noticing that the German SS man who is present is described. Well, if we take her mastery of perspective, we can see that she is deliberately describing or drawing the German in a smaller scale. So it's like, in the end, we were the stronger, we who had the values, whereas the oppressor is the small man and the skinny man. I can't help seeing a kind of a, what can you say, a revenge for Jutta Bornstein in the way she's drawing the opponent, the oppressor. Let me end with a poem by also by Alex Eisenberg. Darkness comes. I've translated it into English, of course, for your benefit. But if you know Danish, you can read along. Darkness comes much too soon. It keeps bashing out of the mountains, beating with its many black wings down on the landscape below, erasing colors. Theresienstadt is already dark. Heavily and silent human beings walk the streets, almost inaudible their footsteps. So these are the bats. In the mountains close to Theresienstadt are millions of bats. I hope they don't have COVID. At least nothing of the kind has ever been registered. But the bats come out at dusk and kind of darken the sky. So many there are, and so he's using this, you could say, natural picture to describe the mental situation of the Jews in the ghetto. They walk heavily, they walk silently. You can almost not hear them. The oppression have made them silent people. The oppression has kind of changed their character and subdued them. This is and erased the colors of life. Although you have this picture from the book where you have colors of life, but you also have the dark, long row of people standing in line to get food. After the war, there was a need in the Danish Jewish community to commemorate this monument was inaugurated as early in 1946, and in the back you see Chief Rabbi Max Friediger himself, one of the ghetto dwellers, is there for the inauguration of the memorial on the Jewish cemetery of Copenhagen, which is still being used today. I was there just the other day at Yom HaShoah, and that particular day, the Jewish school was there and singing and reading all the names, and 6 survivors of Theresienstadt were still present, because we are in the situation, as you all will be painfully aware, that very soon there are no survivors left who are able to tell us these stories, leave us these accounts. Those 6 survivors were asked, how old were you at the day of deportation? And the age range was between 2 years and 8 years. So no one who was not a child survivor is still around today to gather at Yom HaShoah at this particular place in Copenhagen. And as having come that far, I just want to mention the sponsors of our project, and one of them is the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, and another one is the Arcadia Foundation. My old school friend and Professor Peter Baldwin, professor at UCLA and at New York University, and his wife Lisbeth Bausing, who put up a foundation in order to kind of do good things with a fortune that Lisbeth inherited. And if you want to know where it comes from, you all know cardboard food containers or drink containers. They were an invention of her father. And for every time you open a cardboard container, a small amount of money is going into the Arcadia Foundation, which is mostly today be engaged in preservation of nature and endangered species, and also endangered languages.